So welcome to everyone. And in particular, I would like to warmly welcome Maria Garcia, who has been a visiting fellow with us and has done a lot of good work while she was here. And, so just too quickly, so she'll have to come back at some point. So Maria Garcia is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Modern Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath in the UK. I understand it's a very nice place. She has been a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the National Centre for Research on Europe at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, so not too far from here, and the University of Nottingham until March of 2014 before moving to the University of Bath. She also previously lectured in European politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and University of Nottingham. So her research focuses on free trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region, specifically on EU and Chinese strategies and the impact of perceived threats in developing these strategies. And today she's going to talk about Australia-EU relations in the shadow of Asia, which is very, very important as a topic here in Australia, in this region. So welcome, Maria. It's been a pleasure to have you. She's going back tomorrow. Sadly, exactly. So if you want to talk to her after the talk, this is going to be the
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, can everybody hear with this microphone?
Yes.
Is this on?
Not something. That's better. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pascaline, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Monash Centre for inviting me and having me here over the last weeks. It's been a real pleasure, if a little bit short. But sadly, the exam's back in Valfargo tomorrow themselves, so about to go back. As Pascaline has said, my research focuses specifically on trade policy. So I've done quite a lot of work on EU trade policy, how it's created internally, how it is mediated with partners outside of Europe. What I had proposed to do today was to talk a little bit more about the Australia-EU relations and how Australia's focus on Asia might be affecting that. But I noticed that there was a roundtable in this very same setting a few weeks ago, actually, I think it was in April, specifically on that topic. So I've been reading, listening to it, reading all the work by people like Pascaline, people like Philomena Murray, Melbourne University, Bruno, and all of his colleagues, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to say anything that they haven't already said and that they don't know more about than I do. So what I thought I would focus on today is to say a little bit about one of the new things that is coming up in the relationship between Australia and the EU, and which does speak to my research interests. And that is the possibility of a free trade agreement between the two parties. Now, as I was making my way back from New Zealand back to Europe last year, I stopped in Australia for a week. And at that point, a potential free trade agreement between the EU and Australia was not on the books at all. The previous government, the Labour government under Julie Gillard, did not have that as an objective. You wouldn't hear about it. However, this year, it's very much out there in the public domain. Now, I would say it's going to take quite a long time before we see any developments in that, but that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll start off by just saying a little bit about why I think actually Australia's policy of deep engagement in Asia is the correct policy for Australia. And I'll highlight the fact that despite that, the relationship with Europe continues to be, and will continue to be, a very deep, rich, and profound relationship. And I'll show you some economic data that shows that actually, despite the absence of a free trade agreement, despite the absence of media coverage, despite the absence of a very snappy Australian policy for the EU, or a European policy for Australia for that matter, the relationship continues. And it's a very good relationship, actually, which I think is what a lot of my Australian colleagues have highlighted in their work over the years, that despite a lot of these negative perceptions about agricultural policy and other issues, actually the relationship is very deep and it continues. So, we've got the obvious map. Clearly, we know that Australia and Europe are historically, culturally very close. But the reality of it is that Australia is very much embedded in the Asian region geographically. And that is something that Australia cannot evade. Ironically, a large part of Australia's repositioning into Asia is due to the fact that in 1973, the UK joined the European integration project. And the elimination of the Commonwealth preferential trade tariffs forced Australia in a way to look for other markets. So it really forced them to realize the potential of being an Asian country. And of course, over the last decades, successive Australian governments have made huge efforts to reposition Australia, to rebrand Australia as an Asian country. They've been crucial in things like the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, ASEAN Regional Forum. They've been negotiating and signing free trade agreements with different Asian partners. In the year 2010, Australia and New Zealand joined the Asia-Europe meeting, and they joined as Asians. So they sit on the Asian side rather than on the European side of that dialogue. And I would say that this is a huge success for Australia, to have rebranded itself in that way, to have established these links. And of course, it's meant that over the last decades, Australia has been able to benefit from the economic growth in Asia, benefit in a way that maybe Europe and other places hasn't been able to develop in such a quick time or so deeply. Of course, the fact that there are very important economic complementarities also help. The fact that Australia has a lot of the minerals and resources that are necessary for Asian urbanization is obviously going to be helpful for the relationship. And if we look at trade, clearly Asia has overtaken Europe as Australia's trade partner. Now, I would argue that this is actually quite natural. I'm not an economist by trade, but I know that a lot of the economic literature on trade and regionalization does argue that geographic proximity is an important element in expanding trade relations. And as these markets have increased, so has the complementarity and the importance of Australia and their importance to Australia. Europe, where is it? So Europe accounts for just under 50% of total Australian trade, so this is imports and exports. That's still an important and very significant percentage. And the reason I'm stressing that is that means that although Asia seems to be overtaking the relationship, the European Union and Europe is still an important commercial partner to Australia. And this is even more significant when we look at data regarding investment, where the European countries of the European Union account for 24% of all foreign direct investment flows into Australia. So that is much more significant to a large extent than the trade relationship. We know, if we look at these economic circumstances, it makes a lot of sense for Australia to focus on Asia. The Gillard government put out the now infamous paper, Australia in the Asian Century, which of course, it's got a very catchy title. So it's had a lot of media attention. There's been God knows how many conferences on what will happen with Europe or what will happen with the relations with the US if it's an Asian century. But that doesn't mean that at any point Australia abandoned its partnerships, its relationships with either Europe or with the United States. So to say that any of this development of ties with Asia has been at the expense of relationships with other areas is probably overemphasizing the point and not the case at all, especially when we look at the types of relationships that happen between companies, between people, between civil society and in other areas that are not necessarily government-led. Now, with the change in government, I think recently Tony Abbott archived the whole Australia in the Asian Century documentation, but he may not have a nicely branded policy, but that doesn't mean that either Asia or other countries have dropped off the foreign policy agenda. And I've been following the Australian media a little bit over the last week whilst I was preparing this talk, and I've noticed that there has been quite a lot of negative publicity regarding Tony Abbott's foreign policy and his maybe faux pas internationally, and of course the current difficulties, particularly with Indonesia. But he started off by making certain statements such as his foreign policy would be guided by more Jakarta, less Geneva. We're not entirely sure what that might mean, whether it means more emphasis on Asia and less in Europe, or whether it means more emphasis on bilateral relationships, less on multilateral relationships. Geneva is the city where the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has its headquarters. So he might have been talking about that rather than necessarily Europe. Geneva is in Switzerland, which of course is not a European Union country, by the way. But by and large, what I think we will see is a continuation with different nuances, with slightly different flavors, but essentially you see a continuation of paths. If you look at European policy, if you look at Australian policy, foreign policy as well, things change, but there is a large amount of path dependency. And that is because these types of policies are difficult to move. There's a lot of traction, there are lock-ins. Even if, and that's not the case because obviously the coalition government is very much in favor of liberal policies and of free trade agreements and of opening markets and enforcing liberalization on other partners. So they're going to continue that down that line. But even if they were not in favor of that, it would be very difficult for them to step away from negotiations of free trade agreements that are currently undergoing with China, for example, because they've been locked into it. So in all types of policies, particularly in foreign policy, you do see continuities. But often the media and even academics, we tend to focus on the differences, even when they are quite subtle. I'll just show you this slide to reinforce this idea. Because of Australia's very strong economic ties with Asia, I personally don't find it surprising, but other people might, as we can see, a lot of the free trade agreement push in Australian policies in recent years has been towards Asia. Obviously, there's the exception of UNCERTA with New Zealand, but that's a different and special case. And the negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are, like all the other negotiations the Gulf Cooperation Council is involved in, not going anywhere anytime soon. But all the other partners are very much Asian partners. Chile and the US are exceptions. Clearly the US is an incredibly important economic partner. Chile is a different story, but if somebody has a question about that, I can address it later. I won't take a time on that now. And what we do see is Australia involved very much in the region and involved also on the two large multi-actor developments that are taking place in the region. One of them is, oh, I didn't mean to do that. One of them is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is led amongst others by the United States. And if that goes through, which there are question marks about, that will be one of the most modern and groundbreaking plurilateral trade agreements. Australia is also involved in another one, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is basically being led by ASEAN and China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and New Zealand. So that's very much an Asian kind of pact as compared to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as I've been saying all along, if we look at the EU, Australia's major trade partners, this makes sense because most of them are, with the exception of Europe and the US, most of them are in Asia. These Asian countries are also some of the places in the world that still have higher levels of protection. If you look at the US, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, typically
Their tariffs for manufacturers, their tariff lines for most products are very, very low. And they're some of the world's most open markets. So if you are an Australian software company and you want to sell your software in Europe, there really is nothing stopping you. If you're an Australian software company and you want to sell your software maybe in China, it's going to be a lot more difficult. You're going to face laxer. I mean, things are improving a lot in China in terms of intellectual property rights, so I shouldn't be too damning on them. But your intellectual property, your copyright, your patents on your software are not going to be as protected there as they're going to be in Europe, for example. So to a large extent, even without any special legally binding agreements, it still is much easier for European companies and Australian companies to trade in each other's countries than it is in Asia, which explains why you would want to put government resources behind supporting agreements with Asian partners. And not only has Australia done that, but if we look at the European Union, we will see that the European Union has done a very similar thing. This is a world map of the countries in red are countries with which the European Union has preferential trade agreements in place. The orange are places with which they've got negotiations ongoing at the moment. And the dark blue are places with which they've got negotiations more or less finished, but it isn't quite finalized there. All the dots haven't been, all the I's haven't been dotted yet, all the T's haven't been crossed yet. So essentially what we're seeing, if things go according to plan, and that's a big if, we're seeing that over the coming few years, the European Union will essentially have a network of free trade agreements with most of the world, except in Central Asia, Russia, China, although the EU and China are negotiating an investment agreement as we speak, and Australia and New Zealand. Now, I would argue that the reason this looks a bit odd now is because the EU has been negotiating a free trade agreement with Canada and with the US. A few years ago, when Canada and the US were also white, this didn't look so strange and so unusual. So it is those developments that Europe has been doing at the moment that make the relationship with Australia stand out. And it's in part because of that also that the Australian government is starting to talk more about negotiating a trade agreement with the European Union. So I'll say a little bit more about that, about the actual trade agreement, what that could look like, and what some of the problems that would need to be resolved could be. Now, as Bruce Gosper, CEO of Austrade, said, Europe is just too big to ignore. It still accounts for just under 20% of world trade. It is still the world's largest importer. It might be the fourth export market for Australia, but it's still the fourth market. That's not insignificant. It is, as I said earlier, an important source of foreign direct investment for Australia. And what I think is quite interesting is in terms of their export-import relationship, it's certainly from the European side, it's quite interesting. Australia exports 33%. So 33% of all Australian exports to the European Union are services, mostly transport and tourism, travel. So it's basically essentially Europeans getting on a Qantas flight, coming out here, like I did, to enjoy this beautiful country. It also works the other way around, actually, and 24% of European exports to Australia are services, particularly transport and tourism. 28% of all Australian exports to Europe are actually primary goods, typically gold, coal, oil, and others. And there's an interesting case in the oil industry with canola oil, which, because of the European Union's renewable energy policies of 2009, exports have gone up tremendously. The EU has lifted all tariffs and quotas on that particular export. And although exporters in the industry say, well, you know, it's far, there's a lot of paperwork to be done, but the Europeans are willing to pay a 10% premium on the product. So we're more than happy to ship this. And apparently it takes up 40% of all agricultural exports from Australia to the EU are canola oil, which surprised me because I've never actually really seen it. But apparently it's used for biofuels and these type of things. So that's some particular developments or areas where, despite the much maligned agricultural policy and perceived difficulties for Australian exports in agriculture to the EU, where actually we do see some products that are doing extremely well in that.
And tradition, I mean, as I was saying
a little bit about path dependency and policies earlier, you also have path dependency in economic relationships. Australia's major trade partners in Europe, the largest one is the United Kingdom. And of course that comes from a long historical legacy, followed by Germany, 20%. Now that also has a lot to do with the fact that the bulk of European exports to Australia, just under 70%, are made up by civil engineering equipment and passenger cars and medicines. And you know, some of those cars, some of them are luxury cars, typically BMWs, Mercedes-Benz, Porsches, they're all German. So that accounts for the importance of Germany in that relationship. From all of this, we can derive 3 points. The first one is that the absence of an FTA does not signify that the relationship is unimportant. When we look at this map, we might think, well, you know, what's Europe thinking? Do they not care at all about Australia? Australia is, I forgot the exact number, but it's amongst the EU's top 12 trade partners. So it's not insignificant by any account. And in terms of many other aspects of the relationship, it's a close relationship. But if you look at this, you would get the impression that they're not interested. I would argue that the fact that there is no FTA or no FTA negotiation at the moment does not mean it's unimportant. It also reflects the absence of major problems in the relationship. It means that you can have a less structured approach to operating the relationships. The trade, the investment continues to happen even without a trade agreement. So the reality on the ground of business and the reality of civil society relationships continues, irrespective of those trade agreements. As I said, the EU has not been a Labour government priority. They issued the idea of an FTA, and Australia has not been an EU priority either. But as I said earlier, the fact that to a large extent the EU market is very liberalized, as is the Australian one, means that even without a codified, legally binding free trade agreement to codify market access and codify the regulatory environment, you can still have a very strong commercial relationship. But as I said earlier, increasingly we are hearing more and more about a potential free trade agreement. In part, I think that comes from the agreements with Canada, the EU's agreements with Canada and with the US, which do make Australia really look like a missing piece of the puzzle. There's also, the literature on free trade agreements generally also has some interesting strands. One of them is the idea that a creation of a free trade agreement spurs on a domino effect with other countries. And you can see that very clearly also in the Asian region, where one country is afraid that they're going to lose out to the other economically, so you have domestic producers putting pressure on the government. But some other people, people like John Ravenhill or Solis and Katata, have identified what they call political diffusion. So especially in Asia, you also have some trade agreements amongst Asian countries that really, they're not really about trade to a large extent. They don't improve the situation with respect to commitments of the World Trade Organization, but what they do is build up a relationship and a forum for speaking to one another. And the fact that countries start to engage in them means that other countries, other governments start to feel, well, we're being left out of this, maybe we should do this as well. So you have this kind of political domino effect as well. And as I've already mentioned, the relationship between the EU and Australia is such that you don't necessarily need a free trade agreement to improve on it. You can improve on it without a free trade agreement. However, there is this talk of, oh, maybe we should do this. There's a kind of, I would say, Me Tooism as well in all of this kind of idea of, well, if you are engaging with Canada in that way, if you have a comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Canada, if you have a strategic relationship with Canada, why not with Australia? Are we not important enough? So there is that element of perceptions and that element of, I suppose posturing is too strong a word, but of each group's place on the international arena, and of just wanting to be present and wanting to be there.
So has the time come for FTA? Well, there are encouraging prospects in this respect. On the one hand, there's always been very close cooperation between the EU and Australia. Despite the Asian century, despite all of that, the EU and Australia have actually been building up their relationship very much over the last decades. They cooperate in many fields, for example, in their actions on the Pacific Islands, on development policy. They cooperate in international fora as well. And I had a nice quote somewhere. Oh, here we go. The former Foreign Affairs Minister of Australia, Bob Carr, said in May 2012, Australia and the EU are working together at the WTO and at the G20 to support liberal, rules-based order. I mean, they share a lot of these objectives. If you look at their free trade agreements, they want to open other markets. They want to export the kind of, well, actually, I will say it because the European Union's trade policy does export an Anglo-Saxon style liberal economic model. That's not to say that the European Union internally is internally united in that, but the trade policy does follow that pattern. And it's very similar to what the Americans and what the Australians try to obtain in their free trade agreements. So actually there's a lot of commonalities there. And very, very small differences. So he said that. He also said, Bob Carr also said things that the EU and Australia cooperate in the common understanding of needing to tackle climate change. And they collaboratively provide assistance to the Pacific Islands on dealing with climate change, and are both concerned in looking at international rules for prevention of overfishing and damage to the oceans. So there's a lot of common ground actually, and diplomats and ministries across, from both sides, have worked very closely together on many of these matters. Now, what do you think? Jasmine told me you are used to being asked questions and that you will answer. So what do you think is the main problem in the relationship between the EU and Australia? Yeah?
It's always traditionally been an exclusion of the agricultural products from Australia. That's upset the Australian farming community. I've personally been involved with a meat exporting company, for example, and they could exporting grain to Europe. So that's the question really would be to you. I don't know whether you want to talk about that now, but I'm interested in if they're talking to Canada, how are they dealing with the agricultural situation there?
That's what I was going to come to. So agriculture is always talked about as the big problem in the relationship. I think when I first came to this part of the world, to New Zealand, I was, as a European, I was so surprised and so shocked that they're still talking about that. Because obviously it is an important element, but it's not the bulk of the trade relationship. It's not the most significant aspect. It would be complicated in the FTA negotiations And the reason for that is that if you're going to have a free trade agreement, you need to include substantially all trade. Potentially, you could leave it out because actually the sensitive products such as lamb that Australia exports are much less than 10% of the exports, so you could leave it out. But clearly that would not be in anybody's interest. So essentially that would be on the agenda. And that has been on the agenda with Canada and with the US. It is on the agenda with the US. I'm not sure how that will be resolved. With Canada, although they have announced the conclusion of negotiations, they were announced in October 2013, they haven't actually initialed the agreement yet, so it's not public. We don't even have a draft, so I don't know what's there. They've been very cautious, negotiators, to not say. So I don't know exactly what has been agreed in terms of agricultural access, but there will be something. There will be some increase of access for Canada to the European market. And that is, I would argue, one of the reasons why suddenly in Australia is much more interested in the possibility of a free trade agreement with Europe. Maybe not so much gaining that much more access, but the fact that the negotiations with Australia, the negotiations that the EU does with other countries, have a secondary impact on Australia. If Canada can export a little bit more certain products at a slightly reduced tariff, that might be an advantage for them over Australia. At the same time, the European Union's agreements, for example, with places like South Korea, or with Singapore, or even with Canada, include trying to export the European Union's geographical indication regime. Who knows what a geographical indication is?
Where it's come from.
Where what has come from?
The product.
The product. And we typically use them for what kind of product?
Here we use them for innovation. Food project breaks and bits.
Yeah. So you use it on all sorts of products, typically on wine. And the EU and the US and Australia have gone across the Pacific slightly. As you can see there, they actually have a wines agreement from 2008, which has facilitated the export of Australian wines to Europe, but it has meant that Australia has had to agree to protecting geographical indicators in a slightly different way. In Australia and in the US, for example, and Canada, and essentially many New World wine producers and countries in what I would call the American satellite, they protect geographical indications through trademarks. So that means you're producing your wine or your product, you've got your brand name, and you put where it comes from, as you said, and you'll get a trademark. In Europe, the system, and this goes back actually to differences in ways of doing it between the Americans and the Europeans way back in the 19th century. In Europe, it's not like that. You don't get a trademark, but the village or the region, or in the case of Champagne, that's perhaps the most famous geographical indication of all of them. In the case of Champagne, it's the whole region gets the certification. So if you're producing bubbly wine in Champagne, you can call it Champagne. If you produce bubbly wine 500 meters away from the border of Champagne, you can't call it Champagne. Now, why does this matter? Well, this matters because these products with these geographical indications can get higher prices in the market. You get these geographical indications because there's some mystique or prestige or tradition or historical reason for which we think those products are particularly good. And just to prove how important it is, I think the French government actually changed the border of Champagne some years ago because there was such high demand for champagne from Champagne in Russia that they couldn't produce enough. And they thought, we're going to increase the area of Champagne. That way, all of these other vineyards that were unable to make official Champagne can now do it, and they can now charge more. So the people whose vineyards were there were extremely happy about that development. The key difference is that in the European system, because the protection is granted to an area, in the European system and in the European market, if you've got a trademark that has maybe champagne has become, well, that has champagne in it as a description of a type of wine, you would not be able to sell it in Europe, and you would lose that trademark. You can't do that. So increasingly, the European Union has been forcing its type of protection on others. The WTO, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property agreement, does have a clause where it guarantees wines and things like champagne special protection. And the European Union has been trying to get that to go beyond wines and to be included for things like cheeses, for all kinds of other products like you mentioned. Now, Australia, funnily enough, has been one of the opponents to that. Now, I would argue that actually there is quite a lot of common ground because, as you said, you don't only give geographic indications protection to wines in this country, but to other products as well. So there is a lot of commonality, it's just a slightly different approach. And I'll just move on to the next slide quickly. Sorry, there we go. And can we learn something from current EU agreements on this? Because that same issue of geographic indications is being discussed with Canada, it's being discussed with the United States. I have no idea how it's going to be resolved with the United States. Simply because they are quite titanic forces, both of them, and they will both stand their ground. However, the Americans know that the geographic indication issue is a very strong issue for the European Union. So if they've come to the table, they're coming with the understanding that they will give way on it to some extent.
With Canada,
Essentially, Canada also had a wines agreement with the EU, similar to the Australian one, so it's not such a big leap forward. And they essentially have a register system. We will have to see whether the EU has managed to expand it to include non-wine products. In the agreement with South Korea, for example, the EU convinced South Korea to adopt a list of 100 geographic indications, which include wines, spirits, but also some hams and other products. Now, if you look at the European Union's internal protection for geographic indicators, I think there are there are well over 3,000 wines and spirits. Not all of them European, by the way, because that includes also Australian geographic indicators and other places. And there are well over 1,000 other food and agricultural items. In reality, the EU is only concerned with actually less than 200 of them. And those are the ones that are subject to counterfeiting elsewhere, or that can be sold in a way in other third parties that is confusing to the consumer. Those core ones, most of them don't necessarily overlap with Australian interest. I think the only problematic one would probably be feta cheese, in essence. That's also been highlighted in the case of Singapore. And in the agreement with Singapore, the European Union is starting to take a more dynamic approach. So instead of forcing Singapore, here's my list of geographical indications, you must protect these. And if anybody has a trademark that conflicts with this, you have to ignore that trademark. Because Singapore's intellectual property laws and their regime for protecting GIs is very much based on the American trademark system, because they basically borrowed that from American legislation, they stumped their foot down and said, no, we're not doing this. What Singapore has agreed to do is to set up its own geographical indicator register, very much like what Australia has for wines, for example. In it, you will not only have wines, but you can also propose protection for meats products, for cheeses, for other things. However, so that means that all EU geographical indications will have to go to Singapore, fill in the paperwork, put it into the register, and Singapore will give trademark holders, and by this really read American companies that are producing products with similar names, they'll allow them the opportunity to complain about it and to offer evidence as to why that shouldn't happen. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Singapore recently passed the laws to put this GI system in place. So they've got everything ready to go. Obviously, they're not going to put it in place until the final agreement is ratified. So the agreement has been signed. The draft is publicly available. That's why I know that that's in there. But it has not been ratified yet. So Singapore is going to hold out until after ratification. But the pressure that the European Union has put on Singapore is, well, you have to do this, or you will not have an agreement at all. But what we do see is a slightly more flexible approach. Now, that kind of approach could work very well in an FTA negotiation with Australia, because essentially Australia already has a wine register, it already has those systems in place. There have been some complaints from Australian dairy, not so much about the EU, but about the effect that the EU's GI, imposition of its GIs in its free trade agreements with places like Korea or Singapore might have on maybe an Australian producer of feta cheese that exports to South Korea or to Singapore, because they'll now have to they'll have to change their label, essentially, and call it something else, or give a long explanation as to why it is feta style or feta type cheese rather than feta, because it's not exclusively produced with, I think it's sheep milk, and it's not from Greece. So that is one of the issues, and that would be one of the issues that would need to be ironed out in a potential EU-Australia FTA. But I think by the time negotiations would start between them, the agreements with Canada should have been finished. I've done it again. Hopefully the agreement with the US would have been finished, although I'm more skeptical about that one. So that means that a lot of these issues would have been dealt with previously. And these other countries are going to make the same objections that Australia would make. So I would argue that by the time the EU and Australia come to negotiate, these things will have been resolved with other partners. So it would make negotiations actually incredibly, much easier and much faster.
There is one big caveat.
And that is, there's the issue of investor-state dispute settlements. This is a new EU power. So European member states have investor-state dispute settlement agreements with other partners, but not the EU with others. Since the Treaty of Lisbon, the EU can negotiate on this, so this is new. Now, this is a very controversial issue in many places, not least the EU itself as well, actually. This has been very controversial in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. I know that the previous government, the Labour government here in Australia, was very much opposed to it on the basis of a Productivity Commission report, which argued that investor-state dispute mechanisms can give foreign companies and foreign investors more rights than domestic ones. So foreign companies could take the country to court in an international court, rather than necessarily through the domestic courts, as domestic companies would have to do. And of course, Australia has a big case that we're waiting to see resolved on this. Does anybody know what that is? It's not with Europe, by the way.
Tobacco?
Yeah, it's the tobacco. It's the Philip Morris versus the Australian government. And why was that? Why did Philip Morris take pause?
In relation to the plain packaging legislation.
Exactly. So this is one country that is awaiting the result of one of these issues. There are also companies that are trying to take Germany to international courts, because Germany, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, decided to step down its use of nuclear energy. So investors in nuclear energy in Germany are also making use of these types of clauses. So these are very controversial. However, my understanding is that the current Australian government is not necessarily opposed to them as such, so it would be something on the agenda. The agreement with Canada, because of concerns about this, they have made available that chapter that is publicly available. And it does create caveats. So it does reiterate the fact that if you want to legislate in the future and change your legislations to defend public health, like Australia did with the plain packaging for tobacco legislation, that you would be able to do it. It includes novelties such as the fact that that whoever loses the case will have to pay all of the costs. So the idea is to really try to force investors to think twice about using it rather than just taking advantage of the clause to put pressure on governments. So we'll have to see what happens with that. We're still awaiting the official signing of this agreement. So everything that I'm saying about the EU and Canada is contingent on it being signed. And of course there's the big issue of the linkage clause. And that is also the big issue with Australia. The EU and Australia have been upgrading their political relationship, so they have been negotiating what Europeans call a framework agreement. And that's basically an institutionalized form of the relationship. That means they commit to continue doing what they're essentially doing already, which is a whole lot of dialogues on trade, dialogues on sanitary measures for food exports and things like this, on animal welfare, on environment, on research and technology, which is actually a very productive relationship between Australia and the EU. So they would continue to do all of these things, but there is one caveat in it, and that is that all EU framework agreements have a little bit in them that says that you must respect human rights, democracy, rule of law, non-nuclear proliferation. Australia respects all of these things. That's not a problem, as does Canada. However, what they do object to is to having to sign a piece of paper that says that, and that says that this agreement, the framework agreement, is the kind of the overarching legal basis for our entire relationship, which means that should there be a breach of human rights or of these principles, we can cancel other parts of the agreements. In the case of Canada, the free trade agreement that they are negotiating. In the case of Australia, any potential trade agreement or trade preferences that could be negotiated. And this is extremely controversial in Canada, in the US, in Australia, and in New Zealand. In fact, Australia is sitting on the framework agreement with the EU. My understanding is that it's more or less finished, and they won't sign it because they don't want to sign that clause. And to a large extent, that's more or less what's happening with Canada. So there are a few things that still need ironing out, but the main issue is that Canada doesn't want to sign that linkage clause. Singapore was also very much against this, but Singapore was very keen to have an agreement with the EU, so they accepted it, and they signed their framework agreement, and they signed that linkage clause. Now, this might be a tricky issue, because the European Parliament has become more involved in international affairs, and they've already put out several reports where they say that they want these linkage clauses, and they want them even with democratic partners that have a good human rights record, because they want continuity across the board. They want consistency and coherence in their foreign policies. And I would argue that this might actually be the bigger problem and the bigger stumbling block to a potential free trade agreement between the EU and Australia. And it would seem, to some extent, that the strangest of all the possible points to be a stumbling block. As I said earlier, the fact that the EU is going to have to deal with that with Canada, and more importantly with the United States, might actually open the way for Australia. Interestingly, there are no documents and there is nothing anywhere that says that the EU is negotiating a framework agreement with the United States. In fact, they've developed this fancy name of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership and not agreement. So we'll have to see whether that becomes the game changer. Now, what I would argue for Australia is that obviously whatever the EU and the US agree is going to be important for everybody else in terms of regulations, in terms of rules for genetically modified organisms, for example, in terms of rules for how future drugs should be built and how they should be managed and how they should be organized. And it's not clear that the EU and the US will necessarily have the same approach. This is going to really be quite a drawn-out battle between them. And a lot of European effort will be put on that. But I would argue that there is an opportunity for others, actually, to come in if they come in with ideas, with good ideas. Places like Australia, for example, Australia has negotiated a free trade agreement with the US. Australia has a regulatory system that is a mix of European and American rules. So actually they do have the experience and the expertise to be able to bring something to the table. They have not been officially invited to that particular table. I certainly wouldn't want to be sitting at it myself, to be honest. I think it's going to be quite messy. But there is an opportunity through other fora and through bilateral relations that they already have with both of these groups to put forward their particular vision and their answers. And they've done a lot of interesting things with New Zealand, for example, in terms of market harmonization, in a very different way to what the EU has done. So I think there is an important role. I mean, certainly as an outsider, I would like them to be playing that role to temper perhaps some of the more extreme positions of either the EU or the US. Whether these other medium powers will be willing and able to take up that role is another question. But I do think that in the longer term, maybe 10, 15 years down the line, I think we will see a map where the EU has special relationships pretty much with every part of the world, where Australia likewise has, maybe not the TPP the Americans envisaged, but something like that, and an RCEP and agreements with Europe and with all parts of the rest of the world. Longer term, I think politicians would like to then make them more compatible and basically build a new WTO. That might not be possible. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very clear and extremely insightful presentation. I think it's been very useful to all of us here. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I hope you come back to the